All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations and writing some code for Murock's Android Programming, second edition by Joel Murock, which is one of the textbooks used for the AWD1112 1112 Java programming class. So we're in the middle of Chapter 5, and we're talking about layouts and widgets. So we're now up to page 132 where we're talking about nested layouts. When you work with linear layouts, it's common to nest one within another in order to be able to align things the way that we want them set up. You can just do drag and drop, but sometimes it's harder to position things doing it that way. In the example that you see on the screen, there are two linear layouts with horizontal orientation nested within a linear layout with vertical orientation. What this does is it creates two rows, which each row can be filled with widgets. In the example you see on your screen, the first row has a text view, all right, which is the word email, and the edit text, which is where you see the cursor. So there's the text view and there's the edit text. All right, the second row has just a button in it. If you have a layout with only a few levels of nested layouts in it, it won't degrade performance real much. But if you've got multiple layers, especially if it's the type of layout where you're constantly changing orientation or doing something, and if it has to kind of redraw itself, you might notice a degradation in performance quality. All right. The author mentions, I'll just say it too, that the table layout is a type of linear layout. All right, so table layout is a child of superclass, or a child class or a subclass of superclass linear layout. As a result, the table layout uses nested layouts behind the scenes, even though you don't specifically set them yourself. So you can nest one layout within another layout, but remember, if you nest too many levels, it can degrade performance. All right. So here's a linear layout, and inside of that linear layout, we've got two other linear layouts, and there's our outer. Hopefully by now you know that an Android activity needs to handle screen orientation changes. So again, if you are going to allow your activity, for instance, even looking at the tip calculator, are we going to allow it to handle both portrait and landscape? All right. Now, with many apps, you want to set it up so it will handle both. I mean, there are people I know that when they use their phones, they have them turned landscape almost all the time. Other people, and I tend to be one of this kind, typically use it more in a portrait mode. All right. So one way that you can prevent an activity from changing orientation is to edit the manifest file and set it up so you get your orientation set. You know, typically in that case you would set it up to portrait or you'd set it up to landscape. That would force it. All right. Another way to handle screen orientation is to use the same layout for both portrait and landscape, and that's kind of what we did for the tip calculator in Chapter 3. That said, sometimes you want to provide one layout for portrait and another for landscape. This will become more important too as we go on and we write more complex apps, or we even expand the tip calculator app in later chapters. So if you want to do something like that, you can create a directory named res layout, for example, res layout -land, and then copy the layout of the portrait stuff into that directory. Then you can modify the layout in landscape mode to make better use of the space that's available. And they show you how you can do that, all right, in here. So again, to provide a separate XML file for landscape orientation, you create a folder underneath, all right, you create a folder named res-layout-land. So under your res folder, you create a new folder called layout-land. All right. right? Then you can copy the XML for the layout that you had previously into this directory and modify it accordingly. And that's what the author is saying. All right, so let's talk a little bit about widgets. Most of us refer to widgets as controls. In Chapter 3, when we started this whole adventure, we worked with 3 types of widgets. That's what we've worked with so far. The text view, which we usually had referred to in the past as being a label, the editable text view, which we had normally called a text box, and buttons. In this chapter, we'll talk more about these, but we'll also introduce some of the other commonly used widgets or controls. All right. Now, some of the stuff we did not talk about before for editable text views. So notice this is an editable text view, but since it's been set up of type password, and that's what we do there, input type equals text password, it's going to show as dots. All right, and I believe it always shows as black dots. I mean, with some it had showed as stars or asterisks, but I believe in here for Android it always shows as dots. So you could use this if you wanted to get a password, a credit card number, or whatever. All right. Now, in this one, this is expecting an email address. So if you look, we've got here input type equals text email address. So if I were to leave off the @ sign, I should get an error message. In here, I've got the input type set to password, so it's automatically going to show like this. On 138 and 139, they talk about 2 attributes of an edit text widget. The first is input type, and that's what we just saw here and here. And that input type will allow us to put in the type of data that we want to use for the editable text view. All right, and here are the types that you can use. I believe the default is just text. All right, but notice there's email address, password, multi-line, number, number decimal, which we've looked at, etc. There's also phone, date, and time. Next, we've got lines, and that's the number of lines that are displayed in it, and by default, it's not multi-line. All right, but if you do put a number in there that's more than 1, I believe then it sets it up as a multi-line. Now, what is this? This is the soft keyboard. Notice it says here, this is the soft keyboard for an editable text view for which we've chosen email address. So it gives us the @ sign. By default, it gives us letters, but we can press over here to get numbers and special characters. Once we put everything in and we click next, that'll attempt to set that up accordingly. So we just looked at the 2 commonly used attributes, the input type and the lines. All right, we looked at some of the common values for the input type. We looked a little bit at the keyboard stuff. The soft keyboard, I guess they don't show it in here, but they do show some of the common values for this. You can see this state unchanged here, but they show you 3 common values for the Windows soft input mode attribute on page 139. They are state hidden, which means always hide the soft keyboard when you enter the activity, state visible, which is just the opposite, always show the soft keyboard when you enter the activity, and state unchanged, which says only show the keyboard when entering the activity if it was previously opened by the user. And this shows you here how you can set up any of those. So remember that an editable text box allows you to enter user text with a keyboard. It's also known in other languages as a text field or as a text box. All right, checkbox I believe we're mostly familiar with. All right, they allow you, so for instance, if I said put your favorite color down and I allow you to choose more than one color. Let's say I've got red, orange, green, blue, yellow, and pink. I might have checkboxes there so you can choose as many of those as you want to. because a checkbox is a widget that allows you to check or uncheck an option. The only new attribute here is the checked attribute, and that determines whether the box is checked or unchecked when the app first begins. When you work with checkboxes, you can use Java to work with a checkbox when the app runs. Again, it's common to need to set the checked attribute, and they show you how you can do that here. You can set it to true or to false. If you want to determine whether or not it is checked, you use the is checked. And they show you an example of both setting the checked here and checking to see whether it's checked or not down here. The checked attribute and the set check method are often used in tandem, all right, to accomplish a task. If you want to work with a widget dynamically as the app is running, then you will need to go ahead and actually add Java code. You can't just set something. You can set it so that it's set when you first start, but if you want to be able to dynamically change it while the program is running, you'll need to use Java. So the checkbox allows the user to check or uncheck an option. But if you've got multiple checkboxes for the same option, all right, then you can set multiple or not set any. With radio buttons, typically you put them into a group, as are shown here, into either a vertical group or a horizontal group. All right, so the first one, of course, is a vertical, meaning they're on multiple lines. The second one, of course, is a horizontal, which means they're all on the same line. Radio buttons come from the old days of when you had AM radio in your car and you had the big buttons that used to be there on the radio, and you could only, if you pressed two of them at once, you'd probably put your tuner in between the two buttons and you might just get static. But if you pressed a button at a time, only one button could be pressed. If you had it programmed to a radio station, then that radio station would come on. So when you add radio buttons, typically you begin by adding two or more radio buttons to a radio button group. And that's shown here. So there's the radio group. All right, this is vertical. The checked is true, so that's showing this one right here. If we wanted it to look like this instead, we would change that from Android orientation vertical to Android orientation horizontal. The Java code that you use for this is going to end up being similar. Notice it's set checked and is checked, just like we looked at here. So they work very similarly. The main difference being that with a radio button, it lets you select only one option from several options. When you select one radio button option, it automatically deselects all the other ones in the same radio button group. All right. Next is a spinner. And as mentioned here, this is pages 144 and 144 through 147, I guess. And they talk about how to use a spinner. All right. So a spinner is a widget that allows you to select an item from a drop-down list. In this example, again, it's also known as a drop-down list. In the example that's shown here, they say, do you want to split the bill? So let's say you had 4 people. If one person is going to pay for all of it, you choose this one. If 2 people are going to split it, you choose this one. If 3 people are going to split it, you choose this one. If 4 people are going to split it, you choose that one. Of course, you could add more options if you wanted to, and you add them like this. So if we didn't want to say split the bill, we could have just said no split, 2-way, 3-way, 4-way, and gotten rid of this split the bill dash that's here. All right. Now, when you provide the list that you're going to use here, what this thing is referred to as is an array adapter. So an array adapter provides the list that the spinner should display. One easy way to provide this is to store it in an array in the strings.xml file. And that is what they've done here. Now they show some code examples here on 146 and 147. All right. And the first example sets up the spinner. After you create the array adapter, then the code sets the layout for the drop-down list for the spinner. All right, so I'll let you look at those yourselves. But again, you can use built-in Android resources to specify the layouts for the spinner and the items in the drop-down list for the spinner. All right. And again, here are the examples, and they're explained in the book on 146 and 147. All right, next is a seek bar. So if, you know, what we have right now as far as our tip calculator, you put in a number. But we could put a seek bar, sometimes called a slider, in here, where you would take your thumb or the mouse, if need be, if you're using an emulator, probably, and you'd click here, and you could drag this over to here. All right, so a seek bar is a widget that lets you specify a value by dragging your thumb to the left or right. By default, it's going to have a range or a domain of 0 through 100. So I could use this for test scores, for example, or I could use it to play some kind of a guessing game or whatever. In the figure, the XML sets the max attribute to 30, and I believe that means that we're going to give a tip between 0 and 30%. So there are some examples that are shown in here. All right. Here, we set the current value of the seek bar to 20. And in this example right here, we're getting the progress of the seek bar. So the seek bar lets the user specify a value typically by dragging with their thumb to the left or the right. And you've got the set progress, which sets the value of the seek bar to the specified integer value, and get progress, which gets the current value of the seek bar. All right. Next, we've got images, and we looked at an image view just when we started the chapter, but let's just go on. Pages 150 and 151, the image view widget that's shown in the picture here displays an image of a restaurant. The content description points to a string in the strings.xml file. Android uses this text or displays this instead of the image if there's a problem displaying the image. So it's like an alt tag. All right, then the source tag points to the image in one of the drawable directories of the project. An image that can be drawn on the screen is also known as a drawable resource. So drawable resources should always be stored in the res/drawable directories of the project. When you work with image files, you typically store them in a directory that corresponds with screen density. So you might have one that's called res-drawable-xhdpi, which is extra high density pixel. You could have another one that was HDPI for high density, another one that's MDPI for medium density, and one that's LDPI for low density, etc. So if you need more control over the size of your images, you can create image files for screens that use these different densities. To help automate the resizing of images, you can go to the Android Asset Studio. And I did this earlier, you may or may not remember, but one of the things I did earlier was I went and Googled Android Asset Studio. And if I bring that up, okay, and I went to the launcher icon generator, we can reset this is the default launcher icon, but I can reset it to any of these. Now, this is interesting because when the last time I taught this class, the Asset Studio may have been available, but I'd never used it. I just made my own image, and usually I made it of different sizes. So for instance, if I wanted 3 of them, let's just say a low, a medium, and a high, and I wanted that image, I would grab that image and save it, and it would be a certain size. Then I would go out to makeathumbnail.com, and I would choose to save it as a 100 by 100, 200 by 200, 300 by 300, etc. The problem with makeathumbnail.com is it only allows you to use these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sizes. All right. We're making progress here. Android supports PNG, JPEG, and GIFs. It's considered best practice to use PNG for illustrations and drawings, and JPEGs for photographs. And when possible, it's considered a best practice to avoid using GIFs. They usually don't resonate well, especially on something like a phone. All right, so the API documentation discourages using GIFs, although they are, repeat, are supported. Here's those different image files that I mentioned before, so I don't think there's really anything more I have to say about that. There's the code you'd use. All right. So let's go over how to show and hide widgets. We'll do the widgets and the... you know what? I can go on and finish the chapter right now, or I can have another video. I think I'm going to go on and finish, although this one will be upwards of 30 minutes by the time I get done. So this figure is going to show you how to show and hide widgets. To do that, if you want to be able to show it, so notice, remember tip percent. Now we've got split the bill, remember tip percent, but this per person is not shown. Why? Because we're not splitting the bill. Here, the amount per person is going to be $13.26, but it's 3 ways. Since we're not splitting the bill, it makes no sense to show the per person. In order to do that and to be able to change that dynamically to show or hide widgets, you must use Java code. And they show you how to do that here, to make something visible or to not have something visible. So the set visibility option, all right, will allow you to hide the widget when set to gone and to show the widget when set to visible. So there's hiding and there's showing. Scroll bars. The figure that's shown in here, that's really figure 515 on page 155 in the text, that particular figure shows you how to add scroll bars to a layout. To do that, you typically add a layout within a scroll view element. Then if the layout doesn't fit on the screen, you'll automatically get a vertical scroll bar. In most cases, you need to provide a vertical scroll bar for your layouts only, but you may need a horizontal one also, and that uses the horizontal scroll view element. So the scroll view widget can have only one child element, typically a layout that contains other elements. The scroll view displays the vertical scroll bar, all right? And if you want a horizontal one, you have to use a horizontal scroll view element. So there's the scroll view, which will show the vertical. All right. Next, we've got a web view on pages 156 through 159. So this basically is it for the chapter. A web view is a widget that you can use to display web content. To do that, you typically add a web view widget to an activity, and that web view widget will use the built-in browser to display web content. So you can display any type of content that a web browser can display. So a common use of this is to create an app whose only purpose is to display a website that's been designed to work with mobile devices. All right. It's also possible to use a web view to display web content on part of a screen. When you use a web view control to load a URL from the web, you often use a progress bar while it's loading to show the user that indeed something is loading. Before you use a web view, you must add, and it's a little different, all right, you must add this in the Android manifest file. and that's the internet permission. So you must make sure to add a user's permission element like the one that's shown on the screen here. And you must add it, okay, after the manifest element, but before the application element. If you put it anywhere else, all right, you won't have permission to use the internet. When an activity only displays a web view in a progress bar, like what is shown basically here, all right, you typically want to add a config changes attribute. If you don't, the web view has to completely reload the page every time, and that can slow the system down significantly. So here's what you'd add. So they show the layout for this on page 157. I'm not going to go over it anymore other than that. On pages 158 and 159, the author goes through kind of a long-winded example of this. So to show you the Java code here that works with a web view. So you need to import the Android.WebKit package. All right, so notice most of the ones that we've looked at in this chapter are import Android.widget.something. This is import Android.WebKit. Most of the code that you'll use to work with a web view and with a progress bar is going to be stored in the onCreate method of the activity. And they go through this and they talk about enabling JavaScript, all right, and then what you do when the user clicks on a link within the web view to load a different URL and what goes on in here. All right. Some of this is a little bit more complex, such as they actually show a class within a class here, which are also known as anonymous inner classes or event handling, that we're going to cover in more detail in later chapters. So, a web view uses a built-in browser to display web content. So it can display any content that a web browser can display. Typically, it'll be a web page. And that web page can include HTML, HTML5, CSS, CSS3, JavaScript, jQuery, etc. A progress bar, on the other hand, displays a visual indicator of the progress of an operation. So in this chapter, we've discussed some of the more common widgets that you're going to end up using when you create Android apps. There are more, and we'll discuss more of them in later chapters. Once you learn how to use the widgets presented in this chapter, the other ones should be fairly simplistic because they'll be similar in nature as far as how you set them up. So in general, you can use the same process to work with most widgets. To start, you can drag it out from the palette onto the layout. Then you can use the graphical layout editor to play with its properties. Finally, if you have to make something happen at runtime, you can write Java code that uses the methods of the widget that you want to work with. As always, if you want more information on this, the best place always to go is out to developer.android.com. All right, and then go and take a look at whatever it is that you're interested in looking at. Okay, so in the next chapter, we are going to go through event handling. We've looked at one technique for handling events that occur on edit text and button widgets, but we're going to expand on that. And we're also going to look at how you would write code for some of the widgets that we talked about in this chapter, mainly the checkbox, the radio button, the radio group, the spinner, and the seek bar widgets. So I'll be back with chapter 6 on event handling in just a couple minutes.